Good morning, and thank you, Fiona, for inviting me here to speak at your Vulnerability Forum about an aspect of consumer vulnerability that I really am passionate about at the moment. You know, for the last year and a half or so, I find that I've constantly been absolutely blown away by the enormous amount of work that's been done right across different industry groups and organizations in the vulnerability space. There has been so much extraordinarily valuable and high quality research that's been done. There have been collaborations, support structures have been initiated, apps have been developed, and of course, there are so many specialist support teams that have been created and trained to provide real support, valuable care and compassion to those consumers who are finding themselves in extraordinarily vulnerable circumstances. So, yes, there has been a great amount of truly valuable work that's been done. But now it really is time for us to recognize that in addition to those who are working in the specialist teams, every single one of us within the consumer affairs space really does have an important and a significant role to play, particularly when it comes to the safety of our consumers, those clients with whom we're interacting, who really do find themselves in circumstances of trauma and of vulnerability. Particularly, we need to understand that unfortunately the reality is that although we do have highly specialized teams, there are a significant number of people who will never be directed to those teams, despite the fact that they desperately need that support. And the reasons why people are very often falling through the cracks, well, those reasons often are because of safety and stigma. We need to understand, particularly when we're speaking of people who are living with domestic and family violence, with mental illness, perhaps with cognitive inability, people who are experiencing things like perhaps financial abuse or elder abuse. It can be extraordinarily difficult for those people to make a disclosure of the circumstances that they're experiencing. It takes an enormous amount of courage, but also of trust, and very often of absolute desperation for a person who is experiencing any type of vulnerability or trauma to actually disclose their need for further assistance. Some people won't even recognize that the behaviors that they're experiencing actually amount to what we would call coercive control, which result then in those vulnerable circumstances for them. So for some people, a direct disclosure will absolutely compromise their current safety. For other people, their perceived shame, embarrassment around the situation will be a direct barrier to their ability to reach out, to seek some support and assistance. And for those reasons, it has become really important now that in addition to those specialist teams who are so well trained, we now broaden the pool of knowledge around vulnerable circumstances, that we empower every single consumer affairs professional to understand what it is that they are hearing behind the words that people are using, to understand when vulnerability may well be a factor, even though the customer is not necessarily directly using explicit words like abuse or inability. It is only with that type of awareness that we will be able to start minimizing the number of customers who are falling through the cracks, making sure that we are directing as many people as need towards those specialist teams. Now, I'm not for one moment trying to suggest that every single consumer affairs professional now suddenly should become some kind of expert in the space of all the different vulnerabilities. Of course not. But what I am advocating for is training. Is that training be provided to heighten the awareness around those circumstances that those customers might be experiencing. You know, so often I'm speaking with people and they're so surprised when I mention those things that customers might say, which whilst they might not necessarily indicate absolute vulnerability, should at the very least, be raising red flags in our thinking. You know, you might have, for instance, a consumer who acknowledges, yes, the signature on that document is mine, but I don't really remember the circumstances as to why I would have signed it in the first place. You know, it was around that time that for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, my medications were changed, and I feel quite vague around that. Now, I'm not for one moment trying to say that there is definitely some form of domestic and family violence in that situation, but what I am saying is that we all need to be a lot more aware of the fact that deliberate over-medication is a very common form of abuse in our communities right now. Or you might have a consumer who asks you for help in either opening an account or closing one without their partner's knowledge. Or it could be someone, let's say, who is making an insurance claim, and you become aware that the damage to that asset that they're claiming about, that damage was caused by their carer. Again, not necessarily specifically domestic and family violence, but certainly a red flag that gets raised. Or, you know, you might have someone who tells you, you know, my partner doesn't actually allow me to handle these kinds of matters, so I'm not going to be able to talk to you about my account. Somebody who directly says to you, my partner tells me I'm too stupid to do these things. Or you might have a customer with whom you're having a conversation who suddenly becomes very anxious, you know, needing to finish that call quickly. A customer who might ask you to please not contact them, promises that they will in turn contact you. Both our industry codes of practice as well as our organizations require from us, from all of us, that we respond to consumers who are struggling, whose circumstances have created real vulnerability, that we respond to them in a way that is sensitive, that's compassionate, and that provides extra care. So now's the time to empower every single consumer affairs professional to do exactly that, to recognize when it is that our customers are potentially struggling, in crisis, traumatized, really vulnerable. Empowering each one of us to respond to that in a way that is appropriate, that's empathic, that's ethical, that empowers that consumer to make their own decisions with regard to their way forward, and really importantly as well, a way that is within specifically defined boundaries. And once we have recognized where our consumer sits in terms of their own situation of crisis or vulnerability, we need to be empowered with the knowledge as to how to refer that person in a way, again, that is not only ethical, but that is effective too, to ongoing or further support, whether that be internal or external. So in addition to that awareness of the circumstances around vulnerability, what is incredibly important is that each one of us understands and works within specifically defined boundaries. We need to do that not only for the safety of the consumer, but actually for the safety and protection of our entire organization, our whole team, and ourselves as individuals too. And the boundaries that we need to work within, well, there are 3 of those. The first boundary that is all important is the boundary of our role. Given that we are not therapists or counselors, nor should we take on the role of investigator into vulnerabilities, we need to understand, given those circumstances, what is our role when our customer is really struggling or overwhelmed? Where do the boundaries lie? We need to be empowered, each one of us as well, to understand the boundaries to the conversations that we might have with customers who are traumatized in one way or another. At what point does that conversation that we have go from being genuinely supportive and helpful to inadvertently and only through the best of intentions actually potentially leading to further harm? And the final boundary that each one of us really needs to understand, again for the protection of all, including ourselves, is the boundary that exists because we must all work very carefully and strictly within the organizational policies, processes, and procedures that exist. So, raising awareness around the topics that are included in those vulnerable circumstances articulated in the various industry codes of conduct or codes of practice, together with an understanding of boundaries, is the next phase in this customer vulnerability space. But what we do have to remember as well is that it's not in fact only our customers who might find themselves in vulnerable circumstances. We too may be experiencing vulnerability in our own lives. You know, particularly now, through this time of COVID-19, none of us have actually escaped the impact of the coronavirus. Every single one of us has been impacted, at least in some respect or another. And when we are engaging with other people, quite often, who are experiencing tragic or traumatic or vulnerable situations, some of their trauma as well might well start attaching to us. So in addition to learning and understanding how to protect our consumers as well as ourselves, we do need to understand just how important self-care really is. You know, self-care, it's a priority and a necessity. It is certainly not a luxury, and definitely not in the work that you are doing, the really important work with people who need support in those moments. Thank you. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have later in the day.